Good to be together this morning. I invite you to open your New Testaments to the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew in chapter 5. We're going to be looking at the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be spending actually a few Sunday mornings kind of going through this sermon, several different phases of teaching that Jesus goes through, some very important lessons for all of us, but especially for those who are looking for hope, those who are looking for healing, those who are looking for salvation. Jesus sets the parameters and the basics and the foundation for how salvation really is possible despite our many failures and despite the weaknesses that we are plagued with and our constant struggle against sin, as we even talked about in our Bible class this morning, of that constant back and forth of our willingness to recognize where God wants us to go, and also our honesty and our humility with seeing where we often go ourselves apart from His direction. And so I want to read beginning in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. Matthew 5 verse 1 says, "When Jesus saw the crowds, He went up on the mountain, and after He sat down, His disciples came to Him. He opened His mouth and began to teach them, saying, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.'" As we get into the bulk of the teaching of what Jesus is instructing, we need to get a good grasp of the crowds that had actually come for this particular sermon. Primarily the crowds were made up of individuals who had just experienced a great period of restoration for themselves. It was on a physical level. Jesus was going a great deal of healing and attending to the needs of illnesses and diseases. In fact, various diseases of every kind. Just imagine all kinds of hopeless scenarios, the destitute, the hopeless cases of mankind where people had just left them to say, there's nothing more that can be done for you. That's who makes up the audience listening to this sermon. It's full of a band of people who are full of hopefulness because of what they just experienced by Jesus. In fact, back up to chapter 4, in Matthew chapter 4, and we'll see who actually had come flocking to hear this teaching. In verse 23, it says, "Jesus was going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people." It was fantastic. It was amazing. It was things no one had ever seen before. Situations where people were just had never in their million dreams ever considered that anything could be done to even improve the situation, let alone actually remove it entirely. And Jesus is doing this as He's preaching the kingdom. And notice the preaching of the kingdom is always pictured best with healing disease. Every time Jesus would go out preaching the kingdom, we're going to see that link with healing people of their diseases. And Jesus is going to use that as a backdrop for the ultimate disease that He came to heal us from, and demonstrating that as He had the answer physically, He provides the answer spiritually for the disease of sin that has separated us and destroyed us and torn our hopefulness and the way that God intended for us to live our lives, and we realize we've fallen so far short of it. And Jesus brings hope to heal and restore us. But that's the backdrop of it here. Jesus was preaching the kingdom, and with this preaching, he shows his ability to heal anybody of anything. Doesn't matter what it is, Jesus can take care of it. Notice it says in verse 24, notice at the end of that phrase, verse 23, healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. Verse 24 says, the news about him spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, those suffering with various diseases and pains. I love this. By word of mouth, the word gets out, and people are saying, you wouldn't believe this horrendous disease, this horrendous illness. And we realize how situations get like that, whether it's leprosy or something that made someone so unclean they maybe could never approach the temple, could never approach people in worship. It was horrible what it did to you socially. We go to the book of Leviticus, and the Old Testament talks about how if you had some incurable disease, incurable situation, you were actually isolated and separated. You couldn't even come to approach God in worship. So these are people who are feeling this sense of everything is changed. Socially now, there's a willingness for them to be integrated back into society. And news has spread throughout the surrounding areas, and there's this excitement. They think, well, if he's doing that in this area, well, by all means, let's bring our relatives, let's bring our friends, and everybody who has these sicknesses, and maybe Jesus can do something about it. And he does. Notice what it says in verse 24. It says, the news about him spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, those suffering with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. People possessed of all kinds of crazy, dangerous, violent demons. And Jesus was releasing them and freeing them and making them whole again. Unprecedented. Verse 25, large crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis and Jerusalem and Judea and from beyond the Jordan. Now notice in verse 1, chapter 5. So now when we get to the Sermon on the Mount, the introduction, it says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth, and he begins to teach them. This is who makes up this crowd, this audience, are the massive amounts of people who have been healed by diseases, and no doubt their friends, their relatives, those who have been brought to faith, who have been astounded by what they witnessed Jesus do that no one else could do. And their ears are open, and they're willing to hear. Now, what Jesus does is he essentially addresses the fact that he's going to show that not all sicknesses are visible. There is a major sickness that we suffer with, and it is the sickness of sin. And we're very good at trying to define our own problems in ways that puts us in a good positive light. Even when we have a problem, we have a way of maybe diminishing it or maybe defining it in ways that maybe doesn't make it look as bad as what it really is. And I love what Jesus does. What Jesus does essentially in the bulk of this sermon, in the introduction, we're going to move on to see why he addresses the people this way, is because essentially he is addressing people who have the same problem as what we see visibly. Visibly, Jesus used all the diseased, all the epileptics, all those who are possessed by demons. Physically, they represent the inner problem, the inner turmoil, what often goes undetected. Because what we're going to find is that all of us, in some measure, in some way, all suffer from the disease of sin in various ways. But we all suffer with it, and we're all afflicted with it. And perhaps we're all being affected by it in so many ways that we wouldn't even realize and understand. But in fact, we're going to skip a little bit, go down to where he starts addressing the law. In verse 21, Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. What Jesus now essentially does is when he has this crowds of people, and we see these people that have been healed, and they feel refreshed, they feel restored. What he's about to do is he's about to open up additional wounds that maybe they don't even realize they suffer from, that were hidden, that were easily kind of put aside because of maybe the way that we have a tendency of viewing ourselves with God. We want to believe the best in ourselves. We want to believe that we don't have any problems. We don't want to believe that as long as we do our best, as long as we're good people, as long as we try our best, that God is going to see that we're approved of Him in some way. And what Jesus does essentially is He zeroes in on every nitpicking aspect of our hearts, exposes it, leaves it wide open as He as a physician is able to do, and exposes how sick we really are. And what He's doing is He's taking this group of people and saying, see what I did with all those who were diseased, all those who were afflicted. Notice how I healed them and I had the ability to do that. This is what I want to do, only on a more hidden level. I want to do that with your sin. But first, you need to realize how truly in need and desperate we are in need of being healed. Do we really see it? Jesus lays it wide open. And notice what He does. He takes the law and He starts showing them how God sees them as they stand before His standard. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, He says, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. And it would be very easy. I'm sure many of us might do the same. Say, whew, avoided that one. Good thing I don't have a problem with murder, because right there, I would be condemned before God. And of course, even a murderer would have a certain kind of reputation that might probably be looked at not very favorably amongst people. There's the murderer sitting in the front row there at the Wellsburg Church of Christ. We don't want that. We don't want to be seen that way. But you notice Jesus virtually exposes our problem with our attitude. Our attitude towards fellow man. It says, I want you to recognize that you really cannot escape this condemnation of murder that easily. Because there are symptoms in your heart that if you really recognize and you own up to it and you look at it seriously and honestly, you'd find it's very similar to why certain people do commit murder or what leads them to commit the act. He goes further and says, I want to look at your heart now. In verse 22, he says, but I say to you that everyone, every single individual who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. You ever been driving and you're minding your own business and you're in your lane and you're obeying all the things that you need to obey by your responsible driver, carrying out for everyone around you, and then you see the guy's got a cell phone in one hand, a bagel in the other. Maybe he's looking over his notes for what he has for work, and he's not paying attention to anything. Comes and you maybe nearly sideswipes you. What's that idiot doing? Look at that idiot driver. Those are actually kind of the words that Jesus says when He says, you fool, or He says, you good for nothing. Maybe we haven't used exactly those precise words, but we get the idea. The kind of attack words of just, you good for nothing, you stupid moron, numbskull. You have any brains at all? Show me a sign. You actually are a reasonable, standing, logical, breathing citizen. We by instinct, right? Our mouths open up and we pour out our animosity, but we feel justified. Well, that's what He's saying. He's saying when we pour these things out, it's exposing a sense of a hatred in our heart, a way that we look at our fellow man. And Jesus is saying we are condemned. The law that says thou shalt not commit murder is essentially dealing on its basic level how we feel about others. And what I'll be honest, I read these few verses, verses 21 through 23, 24. I don't need to read any further. Jesus, I'm guilty. Anybody here feel like you're past it? If so, well, let's keep reading. Maybe some have said, well, no, I've never done that. I'm not guilty of that. Well, notice what he says in verse 23. He says, therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and then remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Notice he talks about relationship. It's about being in good standing with our fellow man, even when they may not be acting in the most honorable situation. How do we react to that? How do we verbally express that? That's what's underlying point there. Notice verse 25. He says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you're with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. In other words, how good are we at peaceably leaving situations where obviously, well, maybe somebody has accidentally or absent-mindedly ruined something of yours, maybe running around the corner, something hot in their hand and it spills all over you, and they should have been more careful. What comes out of our mouth? What's wrong with you? Do you ever pay attention at all? That's what you're saying, that the instinctive way we react to that. Maybe not even really actually said it, but he says, as long as it's in our heart, it's there. And that we have a problem with that. How about verse 27? He moves on to another one. How about thou shalt not commit adultery? I'm sure many of us would say, well, no. You can't say I'm guilty of adultery. He says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. I believe the Lord is being a bit facetious here, or using this rhetorical statements. If your eye causes you to stumble, no. No, there's issues with that. We know all across the board how many times we've seen mankind struggle with that at various levels. Verse 31. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Well, even when I have been sending my wife away and maybe taking another spouse, well, it's been legal. I've used the proper procedure. He said, how about some of the crazy, ridiculous reasons why some people have put their spouses away? How about the unjust reasons? How about all the accusational reasons why we say, I just can't get along, or I just can't stand this person. I don't know why this person always does this every single Tuesday, or every time this conversation comes up, this is how we reacted. So I just can't live with this person. He's dealing with that. In verse 34 he says, but I say to you, or verse 32, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And he convicts them in saying that on so many, you've legally gone through the appropriate authoritative measures that, yes, I can't live with this person anymore, so I'm going to take another one. And exposes the selfishness and the irreconcilable nature of our stone cold ways that we will not forgive, we will not discuss. I'm sorry, this is the last time I'm going to put up with this, and it's over. How about verse 33? He says, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is evil. Any one of us ever made a statement to make sure that it kind of falls in our favor somehow, or gives us some kind of a loophole? Don't we sometimes find ourselves guilty of when we're making definitions of things and defining terms and defining whether or not I'm responsible for something or not? Well, so long as this happens and this happens and I'm wearing this outfit, well, then it's not my fault. Or I'm going to do it. Or I'll be the one responsible. How about just saying, yes, I'll do it? No, I'm not going to agree to this. We have a tendency to look out for our own best interest and to selfishly manipulate our words and manipulate circumstances in a way that benefits us in the end. In verse 38, he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Here's where it gets really, really condemning. Is where maybe we go through that initial list of commandments, and maybe we feel, well, okay, maybe I'm guilty on some of these points. But overall, I'm a good person. Overall, I try my best. I have my weaknesses just like anybody else. And you know what? I try to be a good person, and I try to serve God as best as I can. And you know what Jesus does? He says, that is so far short of what God's standard is, it's almost laughable. God can't use that. Any statement that someone says, well, I'm trying to be a good person, God says, what does that mean to me? That means absolutely nothing, because he shows what our definition of good falls so far short of what God's actual demonstration of it is. And this is what he's talking about in verse 39. He says, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. What about you? How many times I feel like I've been enforced in that first mile, and I'm tapping my foot. I'm like, what's this first hour getting up with? When can I go back and do the things I'm supposed to be doing right now? Versus, well, I know I wasn't planning on doing that today, but you need help, I'll gladly. Anything else I can do? We tend to look out for our own interests. In verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect or complete as your heavenly Father is perfect. And the full reaction, if we honestly let what Jesus teaches on down here to the end of chapter 5, this is the intended result of what he said in the very first verse. It should bring people to the point where now we're seeing why he said, blessed are the poor in spirit. Because if we honestly let this teaching hit us and let it convict us where it needs to, there's no other result but to feel pretty bad about where I maybe have felt my definitions of good and how far they've sunk into God's eyes. And means nothing. And I realize my own goodness and my own attempts do not protect me in one bit, and I become guilty in the eyes of God. And I realize, but bigger than that, I've got a problem. I've got a disease. And what he's trying to show is trying to demonstrate. Remember the same urgency, that same need, where all these flocks of people, and they found out that Jesus could heal people. That yes, I've got a problem. I'm an epileptic. I've got a problem. I can't walk. I can't see. And they recognized the limitations and how difficult life was because of that. And they wanted to get better. And that's what Jesus was trying to demonstrate with this sermon, is first zero in, as the good physician does, and he gives us the prognosis, and it's not good. And he basically just tells us, you are all diseased. Every one of us. But the good news is that our willingness to admit that and seek him, he is willing to be with us and help us and lead us and heal us as he did all the other physical diseases, which is why he says what he says in verse 3. Back up to chapter 5, verse 3. Here's the remedy. Here's the solution. Here's what he says, what he offers. Now that we sense that we have a problem, good news. You're on the right track to actually coming back to God. The first step is recognizing your great need. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In other words, nobody gets into the kingdom with this confident attitude of just, well, I think I'm doing a pretty good job of being a good person. Yeah, the reality, and I don't like to admit it, just like I don't know anyone else who likes to admit it, is that I have a problem. I have a problem with how I view myself. I have a problem with how I view other people and situations. I have a problem of respecting boundaries. I have a problem with being totally honest and forthright and open and objective. I will look out for myself if given the opportunity. And Jesus says that, Daniel, the fact that you recognize it and the fact that you feel humbled by it, good news, because I want to bring you to a place where I can fix that. I can do something about that if you'll let me, just as I healed all these other physical diseases. There's hope for you. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The next stage, it says in verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle or the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. In other words, they recognize that it's going to take the gentle, meticulous hands of a physician, and we're going to have to follow his prescribed orders to the letter. And if I'm willing to recognize I have the problem and he's the physician, I will do exactly, and I will go exactly where he goes, where I can find a solution for this. In verse 6, it says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. In other words, when I recognize that the true way of the only one who really demonstrates on any level how to truly be approved unto God, it's Jesus. And when it starts with my own love of insatisfaction, my own level of I recognize where I've fallen so far short, but when I see Jesus and I see how perfect he is, I begin to hunger and thirst for the solution and the gentle way he wants to provide that for me and to follow him. And I begin thirsting and hungering for more of that teaching and more of that direction because he's so willing to give it to us. And verse 7, something else happens. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. I begin to look at my fellow man. I begin to look at others around me with a sense of compassion and recognize, as we talked about this morning, we're all in the same boat. There's not a single one of us that can't go through that list and not find something where we're condemned or something where we have a problem. But the good news about that is we're all in the same place, and Jesus is looking to find all those who simply recognize that they need to change, need to come to him, and he gladly brings that through the gospel, even though we're so full of this sin. Notice it says in verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. In other words, as we begin to hunger and thirst for righteousness, as we begin to be merciful towards our fellow man, and we see all the problems we have, we begin to realize, wait a minute, we can work together. Wait a minute, we can find unity. We can solve our problems. Because it doesn't start with saying, you know what, you're the problem. It starts with saying, wait a minute, you know what, I'm going to start addressing my problems. And I'm glad to pray for you as you deal with your problems. And as we humbly come together, we know how we can fill in the gaps and say, well, wait a minute, this individual has a strong point that I don't have. And maybe I have a strength that maybe this individual doesn't have. And together we fill in these gaps and we solve problems. And we start working together and resolving conflict. Amazing how that's possible. In verse 10, blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In other words, all those, as Jesus is going to battle the self-righteous, pharisaical, devoted law keepers, those who believe that the only way you can be approved of God is that you lived on these things so perfectly. And the blessing was that you realized that even in your imperfection, as long as you were loyal and devoted to follow the direction Jesus has for you, He will gladly work with you, heal you, and correct you, even as we continue to struggle along the way. Because as Jesus sums all this up in a few chapters later, He essentially is inviting all those who heard this sermon and the sermons to follow, is that if they would just come unto Him, He would gladly give them rest. Read these comforting words in Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 28. It says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden. Note one thing, we will never ever find the rest that Jesus assures us unless we ever come to an honest place and admit that I have these problems. That's what He's saying, come to me, you who are heavy laden. In other words, don't come to me and say, well, I hope you didn't see that. Don't tell someone, no, that you know about this. That's what He's saying. He said, I'm telling you, all you who feel the weight and the burden of the sickness that I've just defined for you and shown you that you struggle with, I'm here to help you. I'm here to do something about this, to go to the cross, essentially, to bear the burden and the ultimate sacrifice, to pay the penalty of these sins, and ultimately give you a sense of that you can trust God's direction, that He wants to bring you back to Him, despite how far you've fallen from Him. Truly amazing love. He says, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. You know, it's truly amazing as we look at the sermon, going back there to Matthew chapter 5, and these first initial statements He makes, but truly is amazing. When you find the way that Jesus defines how we all struggle with our sin, don't you find it amazing that He invited and allowed all those sick people to come to Him and listen to Him? Which He didn't say, well, those of you who struggle with adultery, you come far enough. We're going to have a lesson here on hatred and murder. Okay, those of you, this row here is reserved for people who don't have that problem. They were coming, flocking to Him. And this picture is the picture that we see all throughout the rest of the Gospels. Sinners covered with their disease situations of sinfulness. Jesus welcoming them as demonstrating the perfect love of God, that despite how far we've fallen, He welcomes us to come and heed what He says and be healed of our afflictions through the message of the gospel. Through our death, as He dies on the cross, it demonstrates His love for us and provides that remedy. We, in turn, when we follow Him in submission and die to the things of this world, essentially carving that love affair in our heart with all these things that attract us, and we say, I'm going to finally give up the sickness. I'm finally going to remove it. And He allows us to do that by a death and going into baptism to rise up to walk in newness of life, truly cured. And while we continually to step by step learn from him, we find he's willing to work with us. One passage I think demonstrates what's truly amazing about the nature of the invitation he's giving to these people. Turn over to Romans chapter 5. One final verse here and we'll bring our lesson to a close. But Romans chapter 5. Paul really sums up the attitude of Jesus as he's dealing with these people who are in such sick situations of sinfulness. Romans 5 verse 6 says, "For while we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous man, though perhaps for the good man someone would dare even to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." That is why it was so important for him to have that visual depiction of all those people and their horrible physical situations. Even those lepers. Remember the lepers in Mark chapter 1? My favorite of all those who were diseased. Because they come to Jesus and say, if you're willing, you can make us clean. They doubted whether or not Jesus wanted to get that close to somebody. He says, of course I'm willing. He says, moved with compassion. He says, yes, I'm willing. And touching them, he cleansed them. That picture is what we need to have drilled in our minds. We think of all these things Jesus is saying in this sermon. Because what he's doing is putting the spiritual application of what he just did to all the sick, diseased people who were so separated, so lonely, and so hopeless, and so destitute. It was easy to see that physically, but we often don't see inwardly how diseased we truly are spiritually. Hence why Jesus uses the law and says, let me show you what you look like when you try to be justified with this. It shows our problem. But that's good. And that's the blessing of the patience of Jesus. He wants us to come to him, but we have to come to him in humility, recognizing that he has the remedy to rid us of that problem. And through the gospel, he provides that way. We invite anyone who's with us who's never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, that you might have that opportunity to truly be alleviated from the burden of recognizing how truly far we do find ourselves as we seek to be justified in God's eyes. As truly the Bible says, there is no one good. No one. Only one. And Jesus, the perfect one, loved us so much, he died on that cross and invites us to draw close to him that he might change us, remedy us, and bring us into fullness with God. Once you come and obey the gospel, put him on in baptism. If you've already done that, we would encourage you to come back to him, repenting of your sins and seeking forgiveness. Whatever your need is, come to him and let him take care of your sins while we stand and sing this psalm of encouragement together.